I'm 45 years old. I'm right in the middle of my life. And I can think of two experiences of grief that have shaped me. And I know that many of you listening have been through so much more. The first one was when I was almost 12 years old and my family moved to Western Massachusetts from Puerto Rico. And it was just devastating to live an island and a people and a group of friends and just a perfect childhood. To come to a place that was so different, that was cold, and a place where we were looked at as minorities, as less than, and that experience really went on to shape the rest of my life. That longing for home, that quest for justice, really shaped my consciousness. The other experience of grief came almost 15 years ago. And because of my own failings, because of my own falling down on my face, I lost much of what I thought was important to me, much of what I thought made me. Friends, career, reputation, self regard. And that grief was devastating. My heart broke into 1,000 pieces, and yet it was through that breaking that my heart became bigger, that I became the best of who I am today. It was actually getting through that grief that I was able to harness the lesson and the wisdom that I have needed in order to make a bigger contribution, to grow in ways that I would not have been able to grow if those things had not been taken away from me. And so, in this series of reflections on finding meaning and the pandemic, in this pandemic, we're looking at what are the things that make meaning possible. And we have looked at the love that we give and the work that we offer and having courage in light of suffering. And I wanted to include grief because I have long been persuaded by Joanna Macy's proposition that we are a culture that turns away from grief. And that because we turn away from grief, we are not able to harness the wisdom that is on the other side of grief. So, for example, we're animals, we're mammals. We know that we're living through the sixth great extinction. There's an animal part of us, not because of the news, there's a biological part of us that feels the grief of the planet ailing because of what we ourselves are doing. But we can't face it. We can't face the pain of it, not collectively, not fully. And so perhaps we're not able to solve it, to address it better, because we're not there to go towards the pain of it. There are two other authors that have really impacted me and shaped my perspective on the medicine that grief carries. One of them is Martin Pechtel, who writes from an indigenous perspective. He's got a beautiful little book called The Smell of Rain on Dust. The Smell of Rain on Dust. And Francis Weller's gorgeous book called The Wild Edge of Sorrow. There's great wisdom in these books about grief, because grief is nothing but the other side of love. No human being will get through this life unscathed by grief. Grief is what happens when we take the vulnerable step of loving someone or a cause or a people, right? And so grief is the impact of the vulnerability that is necessary for us to love boldly. And so what we're looking at is how to find the wisdom that happens when we go through grief well. And here's a couple of things that I want to say about grief before I let you go today. Grief is both deeply individual. It is a lonesome process. It is a way of going into the the hardest parts of yourself by yourself. Grief is also communal. We all need to be held in grief, even as we all need to be alone in it. And so that's a balance to keep. And then we have to ask ourselves, how do we support people who are grieving right now when we can't hold them physically, when we can't be next to them as they cry? And that takes me to the next part, which is tears are integral to grief. It is in crying and crying and releasing and crying that we begin to wash ourselves from the inside out and to begin to make room for healing. My grandfather, rest in peace, rest in power, he passed quite recently. A new ancestor, he lost his son, his firstborn son. He said it was years of grief, and he talks about taking long walks, walking for hours, and of the serenity prayer, of accepting the things you cannot change. He taught me a lot about grief. There's crying, there's walking, there's journaling, there's speaking, repeating yourself over and over again, the same stories, the longing, the why you don't understand why this is happening. And the friend that holds you as you say the same story over and over again. This was a big part of my own grieving process, and the people that helped me through it, they have my eternal loyalty. And so that's part of what we want to look at. How do we pray together on this Zoom calls? How do we listen to each other's stories? How do we check on each other as we grieve? Because this is a moment of collective grief, and turning towards it would allow us to harness the wisdom that we need to come out of this stronger and better able to turn towards the challenges facing the species today. Let's do this. Let's have the courage to open our heart even as it breaks.